Hello and welcome to Frankfurter Buchmesse 2022 finally, and welcome to this great and important panel on how to diversify a media company. My name is Jara Hoffmann.
And my name is Celia Pabe, and we're very happy to host you today.
We're both journalists, and as journalists, we report about diversity, we show what's missing, and also we show people and institutions that offer solutions on how to change it. But the question is, how diverse are we ourselves thoroughly as a media company? And I guess you know that there's a lot to do, so let's not waste any more time on an intro and move on to our great guests.
I'm happy to introduce to you Chipone Timbelu. He is a Zambian-American journalist working at Deutsche Welle, where he often covers topics about diversity and inclusion. Welcome. Yes, a round of applause. Then we welcome Jessica Gidamu. She works as a global director for diversity and inclusion at Springer Nature. Welcome, Jessica. Zai Sila is an actress and content creator from Britain. In her videos on TikTok, she focuses on questions of representation and diversity as well. Welcome, Zai. And then we have Sean Williams, the co-founder and managing director of the Impact Company, a diversity, audience, and cultural consultancy. Welcome, Sean. And then there is Latoya Rose, VP of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Macmillan Publishers in New York. She's not on stage with us today, but we were able to send her a couple of questions beforehand, and she sent us a few video answers. And we'd like to start with one of these answers. We asked Latoya what she and her colleagues achieved so far in the area of diversity management at Macmillan Publishers, and we wanted to know what she's really, really proud of. This is her answer.
Pretty early on, we were able to identify a core set of actionable, high-level objectives. We were then able to translate these concepts into sustainable behaviors, procedures, and processes across the organization. Through our productive dialogue, we were able to have conversations with members of traditionally marginalized communities, and we wanted to know what kept them from our industry. And what we found out was that one of the things were low entry-level salaries. And so we are proud to say that we led the industry in raising entry-level salaries. In 2021, 47% of our new hires were people of color. We have been able to provide consistent and sustainable reinforcement and support to all our employees, especially those in traditionally marginalized communities. Our organization has made amazing progress. Increasing diversity in the content we produce, the authors we work with, and the talent we acquire, retain, and develop. I am really proud of our progress. I'm proud to say that everyone in the Macmillan community, from the CEOs to the very most junior person, is truly dedicated to this journey. We're a community, we're in this together, and that has made all the difference.
So Latoya just said that Macmillan's just like a community. In Germany, it's not like that. Normally, work and private life is totally separate, and you don't see in a work environment yourself as a community. So, do we have to change the way we see our work and see our colleagues as well in order to achieve a diverse and inclusive organization?
I can start. I think we definitely need to work on changing the way we see each other. I think there's definitely sort of a difference between management and everyone else, let's put it that way. And if you can sort of reduce the barrier between management and everyone else, then you can really become more inclusive. And I think one good example of that in terms of what we do or what we've been doing at Deutsche Welle is the initiative that got me into the editor-in-chief's office. It wasn't part of the structure until she became editor-in-chief, Manuela Kasper-Claridge, and then she decided to get some people to work with her as advisors on certain topics, for different topics. And we meet on, a regular basis pretty much every week. Sometimes we meet ad hoc if there's a question where she feels that she needs to maybe consult with different people. And it's not just us she's consulting with. We also sort of expand her network and speak with other people who sort of also approach us. As being the only black person on that board, a lot of people of color and black people feel freer to approach me because of course they see me and they think, okay, this person has an experience like me, and obviously he has access to our editor-in-chief. So that enables that discussion to sort of flow more organically than sort of forced, even though the editor-in-chief has, like open office hours every week and that sort of thing. But there's still that sort of barrier, and sometimes you sort of need to include other people in the organization to enable more communication channels with everyone else and more of a dialogue as well. So at least it's working for us, and it's probably one of the best things, and I enjoy my work more as a result of that, and I feel that I have more of an impact as well. So I think that's one way. So it's one example. I don't know what the others have to say.
I'd happily add something. I think it's really important that as on an individual level that we also remember that there might be things that make up a person or diversity in general that we might not see or that we might not be aware of, and that we remind ourselves that we listen to people who have different experiences than us, and then thereby we learn also that we always keep this mindset that there's so many things that we don't realize that make up diversity in general, and that it's really important to also take that into account.
I want to say that in terms of how we perceive the world, movies, films, books, production companies, publishers are really like the decision makers in terms of like how we see the world. Because we've had so many movies, books that influence the way we see things, what we do, movies that made us go travel somewhere or try some new food. So that just goes to shows how the media is very much a big influence on how we perceive the world. So it's important as well for publishers, media companies, production companies, streaming platforms to really choose movies, books that reflect the society that we live in and in a way that is authentic, so that as well like communities feel represented, feel seen, feel understood, and that just strengthen that feeling overall.
Completely agree. I absolutely want to agree with that. And I think for us as a scientific publisher, that kind of expands this thought to also science, like who creates science, how representative is science of the diverse communities that we serve. And so while my remit at Springer Nature is internal, so I look at everything that has to do with people, with culture, processes, policies, and so forth, still these two things are very much interrelated, like how diverse we are as a company, how representative we are of the various communities that we work with, also influences access to networks and how we can interact with those communities. So I think these two things are very much related, and that's why it's extremely important to be representative. And coming back to what you said, like, do we need to see people differently? Yes, I would say yes, we do. And I think in Germany there's a bit of a tendency to, as you say, separate our private life from who we are otherwise. And that's not always really possible. It's not possible for everyone. And it's also the question, do we really need to do that? Is that really, is that really, do we see the full person if we do that? And because the thing is that, of course, we can kind of keep who we are as people in a box that has nothing to do with work, but nonetheless the experiences that we make, they're there nonetheless. Like when you are a black person or the only black person in an organization, people react to you in a specific way, and that is the case whether we name it or not. And I think that is the case with many things. Like when we name them, we can also acknowledge different experiences that people have.
Yeah. So we had Latoya telling us about her specific achievements at Macmillan Publishing. My next question would be for you guys. What kind of achievements are you proud of at your respective companies? I mean, Zaya, you're not working for a company, but what are you proud of what you've been able to do in these past years regarding representation?
Wow, I think being able to touch so many people, because there's like, I mean, I don't mean to boast, but it's like more than a quarter million.
Yeah, you can do.
More than a quarter million people following me, and so I get on a daily basis so many messages about books that I recommend, movies I recommend that people watch because I said they were good, and obviously all of those are, black movies showcasing black experiences, black stories. And so it's incredibly empowering to have people say, I learned this because of you, thanks to you. And it's just such a big impact on our society, the way we see things, the way we interact with each other, and to be part of that change is one of, I guess one of my biggest accomplishments. Yeah.
Chipana, what about you at Deutsche Welle?
Is it my achievement or the organization's?
Well, it depends. Depends on what
mean,
you've been able to implement.
I'll try and answer it in one response. I think the CR Council, this board I mentioned, is really one achievement that has allowed me to have a bigger impact. We have 32 languages that we broadcast in at Deutsche Welle, or at least where we have like online news. Being part of this board has allowed me to contribute in terms of what we, talk about in terms of wording. How do we refer to, the LGBTQ plus community in different languages, or how do we, make sure that that's right? How can we frame stories about racism or discrimination in the right possible way when we're talking about femicide? How do we do that? That's extremely important. These are stories that impact people on a daily basis and millions of people across the world. And so I really feel that and I see that. And being part of this board, like I talked about, the dialogue has also allowed us to have a bigger impact, because it's not just about us talking about it, it's really about us having conversations with our colleagues and inviting the colleagues who we think have the knowledge to add to this conversation that we're having in the organization about how we cover certain stories. And I think that's been in lots of ways revolutionary, even in terms of how I perceive my contribution to journalism, because it's beyond me working as a journalist on my own and maybe getting everything right or most of it right on my own, but rather trying to work across the organization and across different languages as well.
Great. Sean, you actually consult other companies in questions concerning equity, diversity, and inclusion. Can you share a success story? Like a story where you started at zero and you were like, oh my God, what am I supposed to do here? And
we have, I think I can share two. One is just on kind of a more of a business or our core work side. We are a startup. We've only been on the market for 1.5 years. So we've been very proud that we've had big companies work with us, small, big, large. We've had cultural institutions, schools, and one project is we did with Blessing Verlag, which is part of Penguin Random House. And they are publishing a German version of the 1619 Project, which is a really big, heavy project from the US about kind of rewriting the United States of America's history based on how slavery influenced the entire development of this country. And we were able to do a sensitivity reading and really to make sure that we find the right balance between, avoiding unnecessary reproduction of, racist stereotypes, but at the same time not filtering out some of the brutal realities that were in place. And that's, I think, one project that we're quite proud of. And on the second side, I would also like to add just generally the topic of networking. Like when my co-founder Yolanda and I started this company, or started talking about it years ago, we didn't even understand what this industry of diversity work is. And now we didn't know anyone who does it. And we thought we were inventing some new business model. But now we have this huge network, and we help each other. We give, communicate with each other. We share information. We do projects together, and it's been really amazing. And I think that's also a success.
Yes. And Jessica, Springer Nature, what are you able to achieve there so far?
So I started at Springer Nature in 2018, and I was the first person in a dedicated DEI role. And I think we've come a very, very long way since then. And it's actually quite nice kind of looking back now, because there's some time that has passed, and looking back is like, wow, we did a lot. Like, we put together a whole strategy. We have lots of different initiatives that we're running in the company. I think just kind of some of the things that I think have really helped us progress. Like, one of the things, for example, is our inclusion and diversity survey. So that's a global survey that we've started implementing in 2021. That is trying to capture data on both the experience of inclusion of different people, but also the identities of those people. So when we look at the company on a global level, how included do people feel, and are there differences when we look at different communities? And that was a huge piece of work, because doing this on a global level is incredibly difficult, as we found out, because even kind of talking about race and ethnicity and finding categories that apply globally is basically impossible. And so that's something that we really worked on, but also just generally kind of creating the trust for people to participate in the survey and share their experiences with us is really something that has helped our work a lot in kind of then capturing this data and really allow us to target initiatives more specifically to different communities. And so I think that's a really cool thing that I'm really happy about and proud of. Also, just looking at the community that we have created, we now have a number, I think we have currently 8 employee networks with 35 local chapters around the world, so people really participating in DI work, kind of creating communities, advocating on behalf of their communities, but also providing input on business solutions. And I think that is really something that when we look at corporate DI work, where we really need to kind of make that connection between community building, but then also how do we actually bring those different perspectives and experiences into the business and into the business solutions that we're developing. So yeah, also we're now a team of 4 people. When I started, it was me alone, so now we're 4 people. So I think we've come a long way. I'm very happy about that, yes.
May I ask a quick follow-up?
Yeah, of course.
Did you, because you said it was hard to find something or a setup for this survey that works for all markets, did you also experience that not only it's complicated to get the right wording in there, but also that countries like Germany just generally are super uncomfortable with talking about demographic data?
Yes, yes, that was definitely an experience that we also had. But I think, and that's why we really, there was a lot of stakeholder work involved, because also in Germany, we worked with the Works Council, we worked with different communities, and people in the beginning are like, why? Why do you want to know that? Like, that is none of your business, kind of. And so to kind of create that trust and to communicate why it's important. And I had a really specific experience with somebody who was like, oh, so we shared our questionnaire with different stakeholder groups beforehand, and then somebody who is active in the disability community was like, oh, here with the race questions, can I just say, I don't care? But not in a bad way at all, but just in a good way of saying oh, I don't mind, don't worry, race is not something that is important to me, or that I see. And it's I think it's exactly this approach of where it's that at the same time, it's I think it was very clear to that person why it's important to collect data on disability, because only when we know, then we can do something about that. And I think kind of explaining that and then making that connection was really helpful, because what we need to have the data for is then actually be able to really support people specifically. And I think with race and racism, I think there is more of an aspect of like, oh, I don't see it, so it's not there, basically. but I think kind of relating it to people was very helpful.
Can I add to that? Because we've been trying to collect more data in terms of our content, though, and that has, of course, turned into conversations and more dialogue with editors about representation and content. At least we definitely count in some parts, not all of Deutsche Welle, but at least in some parts, the voluntary initiative. It's part of a wider initiative which is called the BBC 50/50 project, which other people who work with content may have heard of. It was started at the BBC, and several media companies and even private companies are part of this initiative to count men and women was the initial goal, and then that sort of expanded to count ethnicity and race, and also looking at disability, and I believe also other categories, diversity categories. But like I said, it's a voluntary initiative, so the editorial teams themselves would decide if they want to participate, and we have a few teams participating in that, and that has of course shifted the conversation, and hopefully in doing so, the conversation around even our staffing will change. And I think one thing that's important to mention, we're a taxpayer-funded organization, and there's a license fee in Germany for the public broadcasting stations. We are part of the same network, but we're slightly differently funded. For us, it's important to think about representation because, of course, we're paid for by the German population, which looks a certain way, so maybe we should also be thinking about it for that reason. And there's a whole debate in Germany about representation and the license fee. So obviously, everybody has a stake in it, to say it quite literally, and that's why it's important for us to also look at our content, and apart from the fact that we are, of course, living in a democracy, and we need to have as many perspectives in our reporting, and in doing so, hopefully we also foster dialogue in our democracy, or democracy across the world, which is what Deutsche Welle also tries to do.
We're going to talk about how important it is to report about, like diverse groups and how important it is to have it in mind later on. But I think it's really, really important as well what you said, because collecting data is such a basic, and I've worked for media companies, I still do, in Germany, and I honestly have never filled out any form. So I think if we can, transfer this, it's super important to collect data, but I think it's leading to the next question for...
Yeah, because we've heard some positive achievements of all of yours. Now we know there's still a lot of work to be done. So we asked Latoya Rose again, what she would say is one of the most important structural changes that needs to happen on the way to more diverse teams in a company, and this was her answer.
I think it's vital that diversity, equity, and inclusion are not simply treated as a people initiative. It must be an integral part of business operations to truly move the needle. So of course we can't just focus on the D and DEI. I think we can increase the diversity in our organizations. It's simply not enough. Companies have to evaluate all of their processes, all of their procedures, and they have to understand where structural inequities exist. We have to be willing to address them in an authentic and sustainable way.
So, structure is basic as well as collecting data, you just mentioned it, but which structures and strategies do we need right now?
Big question.
I'll happily start. I think one thing that was touched on, or that this question already says, right, structure. I think one of the main, this is more of a strategy rather than a structure, but one of the main issues we encounter in our work is that, especially in Germany, a lot of people focus on the individual approach and individual problems, right? So things like trainings, awareness, also a moral dimension of, I want to do the right thing, then we write these, diversity statements and claims, and all those things are legitimate, but it's really important to understand that structural issues will never be fixed by individual approaches, and it's really important to understand that while on paper, there might be, the same trajectory for everyone in a company to move up into the C-level, along a career. There's so many hurdles or an unlimited set, of course, of different diversity dimensions that influence this, but structural issues have to be tackled in a structural way, and that means allowing resources, right, spending money and time on this, and or just accepting that some things are not only individual, but they are systemic.
Could you give like concrete examples here?
For example, one thing that I think, one specific issue is that in companies we have these recommendation systems, right, where you bring in someone that you know to the company and you get rewarded for it, and a lot of companies do it because it's super efficient and it's a very cheap way to hire. So on a business side, it's completely understandable, but the problem is that you recreate statistical twins. You have, typically people will then, bring in a person from the same gender, from the same university that they played football with, and that's the same age as them. And this way you create these statistical twins, but you create a bit of a barrier for people who might not be in that same environment to break into these companies. Just as like a concrete example, so we would have to have a structural system in place which would not maybe replace these recommendation tools, but where you have some sort of counterbalance, where you deliberately look for people from other environments, right? So you deliberately post your job placements on, in different smaller groups rather than only on the big LinkedIn and Indeeds and so on. So you kind of deliberately create some sort of structural pipeline of bring in different perspectives.
That will require you understanding that there's a lack of diversity in your company at first. And I feel like, is that something that companies in Germany do in general?
Understand that there's a problem?
Mm-hmm.
Some yes, some no, I would say.
So what do you guys think about the structures? I mean, I think with what you do, you give a lot of great content, but maybe you can see from what you do, what media companies miss.
I think that when it comes to like putting out a movie or putting out a book, in terms of the book side, I get a lot of questions of always, I'm white or I'm not black and I'm looking to write black characters, what can I do? And in movies, what I think happens a lot is when they're telling a black stories, and for me, that's the responsibility of a media company. They're telling a black story, they're telling a black experiences, but there are certain things in the details that are missing. Now, the two common points between those two examples is that authenticity and the fact that I, as a black person, I'm going to be like, oh yeah, I relate to that, like that's true, that's authentic, are the details. And when I mean the details, I mean, how do the hair look like? What kind of makeup is she wearing? The dresses, the culture, where is she coming from? Where was she born? Are they mixed? And all kinds of different questions that you have to ask yourself, but that really have to be based on true facts. I mean, up until this moment, you can still watch some TV shows. I'm not going to name it, but you can still watch some TV shows where, you look at the wigs and you're like, this is not right. This is not right. There's something wrong. And obviously, it's kind of like relates to your point that you said earlier on about, people not knowing. So they're like, I even had someone, when I made this point in my story quite a couple of times, and I had someone DM me say, oh, maybe it's about the budget. I was like, I think it's really important to keep those elements in mind about really making authentic black characters of color, and really thinking about everything. And if you don't know, hire people who know, who have the expertise, and that should be part of the strategy as well. And that's so important, because then if you go on with that ignorance, doing that movie or writing that book, then there's not only is there going to be backlash, there's going to be a part of the community that's going to be like, that book has stereotypes, is racist, or that movie didn't do that well, and that's not good publicity anyway. That's not a good strategy that you should have in communications marketing whatsoever. True. So it is in a media company's benefit to do the research, or hire the right people who have the expertise in hair, makeup, whatever culture, country. So that is also should be part of the structure, should be part of the strategy of a media company.
Yes. Yes, agreed. And yeah, maybe to piggyback off that, I think it's authenticity, and when I look at what organizations can do internally, it is about representation, or it comes back to representation, because only when there is representation internally do people, then there will be people who can flag something, for example, when something doesn't feel right or isn't right in how something is described, and in our context that might be educational content or scientific content, but if there's no representation of that group who we are writing about, and that can be black people, people of color, but also when we look at gender and how we speak about gender or gender identities, when there's no representation, nobody can flag things that are problematic. And that ends up in not being good for the organization either, because that leads to a lot of problems down the road. So I think the goal is to really be representative of the communities. And for that to happen, there's a lot of structural change that needs to take place. We need to bring in people into organizations that look like the people that we're talking about, or that have share an identity with them. And to do that, we need to hire differently. We need to ensure that people move through organizations in an equitable way, so that, we see that with gender, and publishing is a very female industry, but even so, we see that in many companies, while there are many women, for example, in the overall population, that doesn't translate into leadership. And so with all different groups, we need to ensure that they move through organizations. So there are a lot of structural elements that we need to change in order to be reflective of our communities.
If I could just give a really good example, I'm a huge fan and champion of Netflix. And what Netflix did in their communication strategy, which I think is definitely genius. There's always room for improvement for everyone. But something that they did that was really genius is that they basically have an Instagram page for different kinds of community. They have Netflix most for the LGBTQ plus community, Strong Black Lead for black people. They have Niger on Netflix for Nigerian people and Nollywood. They have Netflix Golden for the Asian community. And so each of these communities have very specific things down to the culture. Each of them have a podcast, and Netflix Golden, the podcast is called Spill the Bubble Tea. Come on, it's just reference that are so true and so authentic. And you can see that because you know that the people behind it are, black people, Asian people, LGBTQ plus people, which is why it's also so important to have that representation internally, but you can feel it as well. I feel the public, the community, doesn't matter if they know or they don't know, you're going to feel at some point whether a company is diverse or not. It's going to be reflected in the way they talk, the way they communicate, the way they market themselves, and it's going to be felt whether it's performative or not. I think you can't fool anyone in terms of performative allyship.
But why is that? Talking about representation, I think the questions that media companies in Germany can answer is how, which experts do we use for which topics, and why do we reduce someone to one stereotype theme and not open it more to other?
I think Zai touched on that topic. You really feel it if the people behind the content that's been created are not diverse, because of course you can call in that other expert, other in quotes here, a non-white expert, or LGBTQ plus, or whoever, you can call them in, but it might not even be a person who's representative of that community. It might be someone who's considered a traitor to the community, and you find that in a lot of coverage when there's not enough people of color or people from certain communities in editorial rooms. That tends to happen a lot, which is why, and even having 1 or 2 people from that community doesn't always help. You need to have those people represented, but you also need to have the dialogue and make sure that it's happening. Because of course, if you are the only whatever in an editorial team, you also don't want to be reduced to that, and you kind of get tired of colleagues maybe asking you about your community and maybe just say, I don't want to do anything covering this or that topic, and you sort of try to maybe develop you in other ways, which is your choice as a person. You shouldn't be reduced to that. So I think we need to change the conversations and try to open the dialogue as much as possible. And in terms of structure, it's also important to have structures which allow for maybe more than one person in the same position, where you have like a co-leadership situation, which we do have in our organization for some positions. So that sort of maybe makes it possible to have maybe one person bringing certain qualities or dealing with certain topics related to that position, and the other person dealing maybe with more administrative work. There's various leadership models which can also enable for more diversity. Also, you generally don't find everything in one person anyway. Mm-hmm. And so I think the idea and the concept of leadership needs to shift in our society, and I think the demands that we see from the diversity and inclusion discussion are really showing that.
Yeah, so we've heard representation creates authenticity. We need to bring in the right people. We need to bring in people in general. To defend the lack of diversity, many media companies or companies in general still claim that the right people do not apply. Jessica, maybe, what would you reply to those people?
That can potentially be true, because if the argument is that the right people don't apply, if I have a job ad and I do the same thing that I've always done, I put it on the same number of job boards, then the people that I'm trying to reach, I'm not doing anything different. So we need to do some things differently in order to have a different outcome. And so, say, for example, there's a specific community that I want to reach with my job ad. I need to specifically figure out how I do that. And there are a number of ways, in our case, for example, we can work with our employee networks and ask them to kind of share the job ad into their networks. We can build relationships with external organization and basically share our job ad to that. We can work with universities that serve more diverse populations than maybe the classic kind of Ivy League university. So there are a number of things that we may need to do differently in order to have a different outcome. And yes, there might be, just thinking of some of the jobs that we're hiring for, some of them are extremely niche. There are only a handful of people in, I don't know, a specific dimension of quantum physics, just as an example. There's a very small talent pool to begin with, and that talent pool might not be very diverse. And that is due to structural reasons, because people might not have access to actually do or get into that field. But then I think that's something that, as media companies, we also have a role in addressing. So kind of working on the pipelines, supporting organizations. So for example, we support or work with an organization called Into Science in the UK. That's an organization that kind of works with young people who are the first in their generations to study, for example, to go into science, and kind of work on the pipeline in that way in order to then eventually find the people in quantum physics that are Black people or other people of color or whatever we're looking for. So, but we need to do things differently.
We often, just to add on to that, we often use the saying, as a company, we should move away from requirements-based job descriptions to results-based job descriptions. And what that means is you don't necessarily write which master's degree someone has to have and which languages they have to speak, etc. But you say, this is what this job will require. You will succeed in this job if you can deliver this and this and this. And then as a company, you find a way, if you have an applicant, to make that work. And you have to think a bit more long-term, right? You might have to train them. You might have to look in different sources. But the underlying question is, why do I want this as a company? Why do I want to do a quick fill of this role? Or do I want people? Because it's not only about one specific job, right? It's about, I don't know, this year I need to hire 100 people, and what's my strategy, and why do I want more diversity here? Because it makes, for example, my content better, right? So I have to invest time and money in this, and then find people who can deliver this, and we'll find a way together to make it work. And in the long term, it'll be, as on the business side, it'll be absolutely worth it.
You were talking about Netflix and TikTok and representation, and yes, it seems like they do it differently, and it's like they have a different understanding of representation as well. But media, especially in Germany, but in other countries as well, they have the responsibility to develop formats, to explain, to clarify, to bind us together as well. So what do you think they should do differently in order to be more diverse and inclusive? Because that's what they have to do.
You go ahead.
I mean, there's of course a lot of things that they need to do differently, but I think they're already trying to do that because they've realized they're getting left behind. So I think the business case for doing it is sort of showing that they need to change how they go about producing content. And like I mentioned, the public broadcasting system in Germany is under a lot of pressure to change, in terms of representation and inclusiveness. And I think there was a report also regarding diversity on the Rundfunkräte, the broadcasting boards, for instance, diversity on the broadcasting boards. So that's the highest level in terms of advice and in terms of certain decisions that are made on the direction of some public broadcasters in Germany. And that showed that there was just a lack of diversity there as well. So I think we're seeing a huge demand for diversity, at least here in Germany, everywhere, and for various reasons. Some of it is coming from the right, some of it is coming from the left, but obviously there's a societal need to shift how things are done. And regardless of how you see the discussion in Germany, I think it is quite clear that the demand is there to have more diversity, whether it's representation of more people from East Germany, people of certain social classes, and also people who are not white or have non-German background, whatever that's supposed to mean sometimes. It gets very complicated, but it's happening, and definitely we're going to see a lot more happen. And if you look at how the conversation has shifted in the last 5 years, I think you were the only person in your company in 2018, I believe, as the diversity or DEI manager, and now there's 4 people. That is obviously a reflection of where we are. So I think it's changing a lot, and I think even the content is going to, or is already moving in that direction, maybe not as fast enough, because a lot of these, especially public broadcasters, are huge machines that if you sort of press a button to move the other direction, they move so slow. And hopefully they move faster, because obviously they're getting left behind.
So we've mentioned some
Well,
Sean,
I could add one thing. I think one other really important thing is, and this is a bit of a buzzword, but accountability. And so I think within media companies or companies in general, you need, while a lot of the stuff is kind of a bottom-up or grassroots growth, there needs to be top-down accountability in that. It's not enough to say, 2019 and after George Floyd, every company made these statements, right? Mm-hmm. But there's no tracking of what are you doing, how are you succeeding? So I think you need to make diversity a board-level topic, just like, sustainability is, and make sure that there's accountability, so goal setting, goal tracking, and reporting, and consequences around this in companies, and especially in media where the market demands it, where target audiences need and want authentic content. And if your big streaming service or publishing house isn't producing this, someone will find a way on TikTok to make that content themselves. So it's essential to business to have, I think, accountability.
Now, you just mentioned accountability on all levels. So do these boards up there need to change as well and diversify?
You mean who sits on these boards? Absolutely, yes. And, along all dimensions, be it race, but also your social background, gender, disability, doesn't matter. Of course, these boards are very, very homogenous. And, it's not something that overnight you kick out half of them and put new people in, but you have to put the structures in place to make sure that in the interest of this company, not of some other privileged person who happens to have tick a specific box, but making this company more successful by having representation and having different perspectives in your board.
Yeah. Okay, so we've touched upon some of the structural changes that are needed. Now we'd like to look at the personal level, like how does teamwork work, basically? And we asked Latoya Rose again. When it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's very common to talk about respect and tolerance. But what does this really mean in the daily business and teamwork? And she answered.
I think it's important to note that we can't just create a diverse employee base and then continue to do things in the ways that we did when our community was less diverse. It's just not sustainable. We need to make sure that we create an atmosphere where a diverse cross-section of employees can feel included. They need to be able to feel like they belong. So that may mean that we need to think about how we speak to colleagues and the language that we use. We need to expand our thinking around things like the usage of pronouns and have more empathy and grace, especially if a colleague has come to us and let us know that something we said has offended them. Bringing a variety of people together is not easy. I'm proud to say that at Macmillan, we've committed to productive dialogue and ongoing education and training to provide our community with the right tools in this area.
So one sentence that really resonated with me was they need to feel like they belong. Employees need to feel like they belong. So maybe Chipona, how does Deutsche Welle make sure that employees feel like they belong?
Yeah, I mean, we have more than 60 countries represented. I think we are arguably the most diverse media house in Germany. We have 32 languages and so many people from different places and different countries. How do you make people feel feel the sense of belonging to the company? I think it's really about fostering dialogue and making it possible for different people to talk to each other. And that's not always easy because, of course, working the different languages that we have, sometimes the various language services also feel like little islands. And there's now been a huge push to have more production between different departments so that people from different departments are working closer together. That costs money, more money sometimes, but that's sort of putting your money where your mouth is. That's just the way it is, and that's part of diversity and inclusion, also investing in it. So I think it's really about making sure that we don't leave anyone behind or leave people in their little islands of comfort, and working across departments sometimes is challenging when you're producing content, but I think it works much, much better, and it's happening more and more. It's not happening quite as much as it should, I can admit that, but it's slowly, I think, improving, and I think we've definitely, between German and English, for instance, I work in a bilingual department. It never was bilingual when I started with Deutsche Welle, so it's changed a lot already, but we have a lot of room to grow still.
Yeah. Jessica, what about you?
I think there are many things. I think on an interpersonal level, I think there's this interpersonal level where, in the way that we think about leadership, in the way that people take responsibility in caring for their teams and creating space for people to be themselves and be who they are, and also, just kind of be sensitive to kind of the different personalities that we have in teams and what they might need, and being quite open about that. I think there is a structural element in belonging to. It's not only how I am being treated by my manager and by my team, but also, do I see people who look like myself in positions of power? Do I feel I can move and grow within the company. And these are not necessarily interpersonal interactions, but there is a structural element to that. And one thing that we saw in our survey, in our inclusion survey, was that people who were part of employee networks showed higher inclusion scores across literally all questions than people who were not part of networks. And I think that on the one hand kind of speaks to the power of networks, but also to the power of community and creating a community where people can just be and they don't need to think about how are people going to react to me and like is there any like how are people perceiving me, but where they can just be. And so creating these communities, I think, is also something that really has power in creating belonging.
I kind of want to add it to that, even though I don't work in a company, as a creator, I get invited to different kinds of events from like streaming platforms or production companies, media companies that are just looking to get to know more the creators that create content on what they do. And so I can definitely say that the events that I have enjoyed the most are the ones where I felt the most represented. So to be 100% honest, there will be events that I will go to and none of the people that I'm talking to that work in the team look like me. So suddenly I feel like if I start talking about my content, there's gonna be a lot of like, I don't know, like you can see on people's face when they say, oh, you only recommend black movies. Okay. And so, but for example, I attended a Netflix event yesterday. And so, and there were just so many different kinds of people looking like me. And at some point I was so engrossed into a conversation, talking to different kinds of people. And we were all black women, but I did not realize it until someone came over and was like, oh, I want to get into this group. It's all like black women and everything. And I was like, oh my God, that's true. And that made me feel so, it's a wholesome feeling because there's no barriers. You don't have to like put up any shield whatsoever or think, oh, I have to code switch or behave a certain way. It's just you feel welcomed. And so it's just so much easier than to talk about what you do, pitch in your ideas, get to know more of the team, really exchange and build a true professional connection. And yeah.
You just mentioned code switching. Could you maybe explain for the audience what exactly that means?
So code switching is very crudely acting more white. I'm saying quote unquote white because obviously people would say that you're talking proper or adapting a certain accent, etc. But talking proper is not inherently white. It's just how people perceive it. But yeah, that's what code switching would mean. That's mean for example, you know, someone. I think from Skins, the TV show, you have an example from code switching in that, for example, if someone who doesn't code switch, I don't know if you've ever watched any interviews with Daniel Kaluuya, but he doesn't code switch at all. You know, he's gonna talk like someone who grew up in South London and, you know, just do things that are just like natural for a black person having his background. And so if you would like to code switch, then you would basically do something that's not authentic to your culture, how you've grown up, and just like you're going to try and accommodate to whiteness and what is seen as respectable, but truly it isn't.
Yeah, so making sure people can speak the way they usually speak is also part of making people feel 100%. Like they belong. Yeah.
100%.
Sean, is there something you'd like to add?
On the individual team level? Yeah, I think along with everything that's been said, I think it's also important to bring along you know, more privileged people on this journey as well. And I think sometimes, especially in Germany, where we're not used to speaking about these things so openly, I feel like there can be this typical fragility or this kind of shutting off when it comes to speaking about discrimination. So I think it's important to explain to also privileged groups in a certain setting that this is not a moral judgment. Your privileges you didn't choose. We were born with them, and it's about how we deal with them, and that maybe even on a very pragmatic level, understanding as a privileged person, for example, me as a cis man, why do I want to reduce the gender gap in the working world? Why is it important for you? Why does my job become more safe? Our company performs better. I learn more. I grow better if there's not as much gap or no gap. And I think it's important also to bring privileged groups along.
And then here it's super important to build allies, right? And especially as a privileged person to offer being an ally. So how important are allies in a company, and what can we do to build them and to make them grow stronger?
May I just say something before, because you mentioned privilege and you mentioned allyship, I guess. I think it's also important to recognize that it's all intersectional and it overlaps, and sometimes Sean is the privileged person, like he mentioned, being a cis male, or I'm privileged as a cis male as well, and that shifts. Or, Celia might be privileged because she is a native German speaker, and it changes and it's very context dependent, and that's very important to recognize that. So in a given situation, every one of us can be privileged, and sort of we need to recognize how we move and shift through these spaces. Some people are generally almost always privileged, but like I said, it is also contextual. In terms of allyship and networks, you talked about belonging and feeling a sense of belonging in terms of the group. I think it's important in the company, but it's also important outside the company, because of course we need to recognize for anyone that you need to find ways of survival and making sure that you can exchange some of these experiences with other people and talk about them. And the moment you start doing it within your company or outside it, it gets better. It's obviously better to start it within your company, but it's hard for a company, let's face it, to have a network for every single dimension there is of diversity. There's a few big ones, of course, which we've mentioned on this, in this round, but I think it's important to also recognize that. And I think the more people can sort of also find networks outside of themselves or where they are, that the better it is. I think it's more so about having a conversation, and you can start anywhere where you work, or if it's not there, you can try to start it there, but if it's not going to happen quite easily, go look for it somewhere, even online. There's so many things that are out there, and I think that's super important. That's where you can also find allies. Allies don't have to be exactly where you work. They can also be outside your organization. And I think that's a point that's overlooked when we talk about this discussion, because we always think of allyship being within your organization. But once I joined the Neue Deutsche MedienmacherInnen, for instance, which I'm a member, maybe you guys are also members, I don't know. I thought you might be. And it just sort of helps you, and it doesn't have to be that organization. There's one for LGBTQ plus people. There's one for people with disabilities. There's different organizations out there, and I think it's always important to also you can look for those networks within your organization, but also outside your organization.
You said there was this one TikTok where you ask a question, what's in it for me to be an ally? And what you said was it really touched me, because it's so true and so clear, obvious, and important as well. Do you know what that is? Can you say it? Or do you want me to?
Oh wait, which video?
Where you said, it's a TikTok, and you said, okay, talking about allyship, what's in it for me, personally?
Oh, yes. I think that something that happens quite a lot is that people, individuals, and especially my audience is kind of like under 25, etc. So a lot of people are kind of like approach allyship, approach anti-racism, being like, oh, this is like people are trying to like bear the burden of centuries of colonialism and systemic racism, but it's like, how as one person can you bear all of that? It's not your responsibility to, carry. And I think that a lot of people are like, oh, I'm white, then I'm guilty, I have to redeem myself. It's some kind of redemption journey, but it isn't. I think people focus a lot on the outside and they don't focus on themselves. It's very much about, this is what you've been taught, it's false, it's not true, now unlearn it. That's all it is. It's a self-development journey. It's a journey that starts with you. And so what Sean said as well in terms of accountability, like, why do you want to be a ally? Why do you want to be diverse? Why do you have those specific goals in terms of diversity, being an ally, etc.? It's very important to ask yourself those kind of questions, because they are going to ground you so much more. And whenever there's feelings of guilt, or whenever you feel triggered, reading a book, or even watching a movie, or having a particular conversation with a friend, those moments where you ask yourself those questions are going to be able to back you up and support you. So you're going to feel a lot less taken aback and more prepared. And so, yes, it's much less of a thing of like, oh, I'm doing something for people of color, or I'm doing something for black people. No, that's not what it is. It's for you. It starts with you, you know. So you can be educated about the world and the society that you live in.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's so strong, you know. It's a self-development, and the more you get to know yourself, the more open, the more loving and warm you are with other people, right? And that's the core element of allyship, isn't it? So can you tell us how you implement allyship in kind of like a structure as well, maybe in the company?
I think there are a couple of things we do that are there to help build allyship. So I think, well, a number of our networks have developed allyship guides, because very often it's also kind of making a first step and creating a base to connect with people. And like you said, I think like sometimes there's also an element of fear involved, that people don't know, like, oh, if I engage with a gay person, or like what to say, like, or what not to say, more importantly, maybe even. These allyship guides, I think, are really, really helpful in kind of making that first step and being like, okay, this is where you can start, and this is, you know, like creating a base, I would say, but then beyond what the networks do, which is fantastic, but also the burden of kind of creating allyship shouldn't be on them. Beyond what the networks do, I think there are a number of other ways of creating connection between people, be that through events, be that through mentorship, for example, where we have a global mentorship program, and then we're also looking into kind of making more specific connections between people in leadership positions and people from different communities, because when you understand more of somebody else's experience, you're also more likely to be an ally to them and to that community. So I would say things that we're doing is we're providing space, and we're developing programs to create these connections for people to learn more about each other, and we create the resources and the toolkits for them to kind of take that first step and read a little bit first maybe, and then actually have a conversation with somebody.
So thank you so much. Yeah, I think that's super important to get to know the other person, get to know yourself as well, and then you're an ally naturally. You don't have to do anything for it. So before we open the discussion to our Q&A section, because we want to interact with you guys as well, and it's also your chance to ask questions that, you want to know from our panelists, I want to close this round with a thing that's super important, because things are at stake at the moment, also in media. And we see on the political side that things are getting more and more radical, and it's kind of like a backlash here in Germany with AfD getting stronger, but also in other countries as well. So media, I think, has got a very special responsibility here and it goes hand in hand with what we just said, with like a soft, warm understanding of people, seeing them as who they are. And in the end, it's all about inclusion, right? So how do we, as media companies, turn things around in society with the help of diversity and inclusion? I know it's a big one, but I think it's super important as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's about inclusion, it's also about equity. I think that's one part of the conversation that sometimes, at least in the discussion on diversity and inclusion in Germany, in media, sometimes the equity part seems to be missing, or is not always mentioned. So it's about all these different things, and the accountability you just mentioned. We obviously have a huge responsibility to our audience, whether they're in Germany or outside Germany. We need to think about how we represent the world and what that means. And I think one of the questions that comes up as well is, I think when you're reading something, you always need to, as a journalist, put yourself in the position also of the different people you've spoken about or written about, and then maybe ask yourself, is this respectable enough? Is this dehumanizing? Is this, is it stereotypical? And it's so hard for some people to always think about that, especially because in journalism, the discussion is a lot about objectivity, and the idea is that if you're objective, then you should be able to say anything. But no, I mean, you cannot dehumanize people and not expect the result to be potentially maybe a right-wing party being voted into power because maybe the debate on immigration is slanted. I don't know, or I don't know. It depends. It's sort of, we need to look at our accountability for various reasons. It's not just about the discourse on certain debates like migration, immigration. It's basically, are we really representing the world as it is? And are we being respectful of the different humans who appear in the story? And then I think we can arrive at what Sai mentioned about really being potentially authentic. And I don't think that you need to be from the community to be respectful. I think we can still do that as journalists as long as we can try to really look at it. But of course, representation helps a lot because those things are obviously second nature to some people. So I think we need to think about that. We won't always have the representation that we need in every newsroom to do all the stories that we do. So bearing that in mind, then we need to, have that check. Is the human in the story, or every human in the story, handled with respect and dignity?
Should I? So I think, totally agree, and I think for me personally, the most important concept here is participation, or in German Teilhabe. And I think we have to make sure that marginalized people and voices and groups can participate in any given space or room. And I think it's pointless for us to use our energy convincing people who vote AfD or other people to come over to our side. I think our resources need to be in maximizing the participation of marginalized people and voices, and making sure that the people who sit in between, or who believe they sit in between, understand that there really is no in between. There's no neutral on discrimination. There's nothing between racism and anti-racism. If you're not anti-racist, then you're part of a system that furthers racism. And I think this is the key, right? Maximizing participation. And this also, of course, goes out to the Frankfurter Buchmesse. It's, in my opinion, is very clear. Yeah, right-wing publishers should not be given this stage here. And I think this is something that we just need to grow into and understand that while this might be painful, we need to make a clear cut and say there is no standing in the middle on these issues, and we have to maximize participation on the democratic, social, and equitable side of the spectrum.
Sorry. I want to say that in terms of really changing the society that we live in, I don't like making things about politics, to be honest. I want to say that for us to live in a society where we all feel included, or where we all feel seen, at the very end of the day, deep down, I don't want to mix politics into it, because it just gets too messy for me. But in terms of what we can do, I think we perceive our world through movies and books. So I think that more authentic representation, no tokenism, telling our stories from our culture and telling all of the story with all the intersections and the mixes and everything. I think that's how we change the narrative. That's how we reclaim it, and and that's how we change minds as well. That's how we change mindsets and how people see things. I think that's where it starts, and that's why media companies have such a big power. The movies that you produce, that you make, the scripts that you write, the books that you authorize, they are going to shape minds, influence people, make sure that you tell the right stories that are going to make a society a better place for everyone.
I can almost not add anything to that because I think those were really good last words almost. I think maybe just, I think I can only reiterate that media companies have a responsibility in this. And I think for us as a publisher, I mean, we see that just kind of when looking at the numbers, we're at the heart of a huge global network of researchers and people. Like we have 90,000 authors and 750,000 peer reviews and over 1 million of research submissions every year. So there are a lot of people that are in one way or another connected with our organization, and we have a responsibility as a publisher to positively influence these communities in some ways. And I think we try to do that in many, many different ways. Just kind of, and this is not really my remit because my remit is more internal, but when I look at what we do to kind of look at diversity, equity, and inclusion externally in our communities, in our content, there's a lot that we can and do. So around policies to prevent harm in our content, guidance on helicopter research. So there's a lot that media companies can do when looking at like how can I prevent causing harm. And yes, there will probably be people in the communities that we work with that push back against that, but nonetheless we have a responsibility. We're not gatekeepers, but we do have a responsibility to shape the content that we produce, and I think where there's great power, there's great responsibility, kind of sort of. But that just, I mean, no, to be serious, I think that is something that media companies have a lot of leverage and have the possibility to really influence and shape the outcome.
All right, so we got another 10 minutes, more or less, for questions from the audience. Is there anyone who has a question for our panelists? Yes?
Thank you very much.
Getting a mic, yes.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting and inspiring too. I was wondering, because at the beginning you talked about the importance of counting people, of studying statistics, and as you may listen, I'm French, and in France the statistics based on ethnicity are forbidden. So I was wondering how can we do if the very beginning, maybe the most important step to make people realize the problem is not really possible to do. I mean, we can speculate, but we won't have the real numbers. And I was wondering how can we do. I don't think if we can't count people, we can do anything. But
so you're saying how can we collect the data?
Yeah, and how can we make people more conscious of the problem if we don't have the very precise data?
I agree that that's really challenging, and I think in France, with legislation as it is, where you cannot collect any data on race or ethnicity, that makes it very difficult to make a case and to actually have like evidence-based arguments. I think it really depends on the context of your work, and there might be scenarios where you can collect voluntary data, although again, it really depends on context. If that's possible. There might be ways in working with organizations that represent specific groups to kind of share their experience. I think there is something to be said on a political level. Is that really how it should be? and is there something that can be changed? So I would say it's a bit context specific, but I agree that there is a challenge that where we have no data, it's very hard to make a specific case.
Yeah, I do think that it is possible through surveys potentially, but of course the hurdles are much higher than, say, in a place like the UK or the US. And I think a lot of people just say, oh, it's illegal. But I think in a lot of European countries, it's not illegal, like through a survey. So you need to find a framework that works and try to, like Jessica said, you kind of have to try to work with organizations that are more familiar with that and can help you with that. But it's not illegal all the time.
One thing we sometimes recommend, if legally or just politically it's not available to do quantitative data, is looking, like you just said, at qualitative data. And if you look at, for example, employee resource groups within companies, so groups that represent certain demographic groups, right? They might not be able to give you a quantitative analysis, but they can give you a qualitative opinion from their experiences, or a similar goes for external groups that you just said. So I think listening to the voices of those people you want to, in this case, address is really important.
Is there another question? No. Well, maybe I have a question for you, Zai. You just mentioned tokenism. Yes. Which I feel like is a very, very important term when it comes to diversity management and everything. Could you re-explain that one, and then also say why it might be harmful for the token itself,
So define the term and why it's harmful.
Tokenism.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I would say tokenism is basically taking a black actor or a black character, person of color, whatever. You take them and you're like, poof, here. I did it, it's diverse now. That's what it is. But it's performative, it's not genuine, it's not authentic. There's definitely not a lot of research that has gone into the character, into the depth of the character, how detailed they are. And so when you see on the big screen or you read about the character, you're like, okay, it's stereotypical, or it doesn't feel right, it doesn't feel genuine, I don't relate to that, etc., etc. And so it's harmful because, in general, tokenism, I feel like it kind of like contributes to dehumanizing like us as people of color, black people, and makes it seem like we don't deserve depth, details, backgrounds, fully fledged stories, and so it also kind of like shapes and dysmorphs kind of the perceptions of people. So people are going to be like, okay, I read it somewhere else, or I saw it somewhere else, so that's how it is. Like, it's like, well, that trope is not particularly tokenism, but in terms of like how people perceive things, like the gang trope in movies and TV shows and books, like, for example, that trope is so overused, it's overrated. Unless you have a very new narrative on how to tell it, no, stop. And that's because the gang trope just makes it seem like every single black person out there is acquainted with the gang lifestyle, like we're all into it, and it's just, again, perpetuates falsehoods, and also kind of like makes us seem like we're all a monolith. Like, again, we talked about intersectionality and how there's so many different kinds of mixes whatsoever. So it's really important to highlight that as well. So yeah, Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think we have to cut it down here because we're running out of time. But it shows like that there is so much to do. And I think what we discussed here is that when we try to look at ourselves and get more sensible, we're going to be more authentic and going to be more open. And I hope that's the way we're all heading. So thank you guys so much for your powerful sentences here on the panel. Thank you for taking part in it. Thanks to everyone here in the audience for staying the whole 90 minutes with us and for asking questions as well. And a special thanks goes to Frankfurter Buchmesse and Holzbrink Berlin.
Thank you.
Enjoy the rest of your day.